An undercover CEO goes to browse at his own bookstore. Stops cold when he hears two children behind him. Thomas Ellison loved Ellison's book Nook, the tiny independent bookstore he built from a single shelf in his parents' garage to a chain beloved across the state. It wasn't just a shop. It was a place where stories lived, where every spine on every shelf held a little bit of someone's heart. But lately, something about it didn't feel right. The reviews were still blowing. The community events were still packed. But Thomas couldn't shake the sense that somewhere along the way, the soul of the place had gone quiet. So he decided to do what he always did when that feeling crept in: go back to the beginning. Go undercover, not as a manager, not as a speaker at Story Hour, but just another face behind the shelves, wearing a faded hoodie, loose jeans, and a baseball cap tugged low. He stepped into the Willow Creek store, the very first book Nook ever opened. No fanfare, no recognition, just the quiet scent of paper and ink, and the faint rustle of secrets waiting to be heard. The children's section of the bookstore had always been his favorite: rows of colorful covers, soft beanbags in cozy corners, and the scent of paper and possibility hanging in the air. Thomas Ellison sat quietly at the edge of that world, a paperback balanced casually in his lap. Though he wasn't reading, he was listening. Just a few feet away, two kids were sitting cross-legged on the carpet, one boy, maybe 12, flipping through a graphic novel, and a younger girl with big glasses and an overstuffed tote bag of books beside her. They were whispering, not the kind of giggly, distracted chatter he usually heard from kids that age. This was different, low, sharp, personal. Mom said the man who ruined her writing dreams still owns this place. The boy muttered, glancing sideways toward the front counter. Thomas's fingers froze on the page. The sentence landed like a breath held too long. He tilted his head slightly, not enough to draw attention, but just enough to catch the girl's reply. She said he stole her story. The girl added, her voice barely audible, and if he hadn't, we'd still have a home. For a moment, the soft buzz of the store faded into silence. Thomas's heart beat loudly in his chest, louder than the jazz playing from the overhead speakers, louder than the sound of pages flipping and the door chime as new customers entered. He blinked, carefully closed the book, and lowered it to his lap. Could they be talking about him? He didn't recognize the children, and he certainly didn't remember stealing anything. But the conviction in their voices, the quiet, painful certainty of children repeating something they'd heard over and over again from someone they trusted, left no doubt. They believed it. Who was their mother? Thomas's mind raced. Over the years, dozens of writers had submitted ideas to Book Nook. Short stories, illustrated books, poetic memoirs. Some were brilliant, some were less so, and some were left behind in quiet silence because there wasn't space or time, or maybe he just moved too fast to notice who got lost in the shuffle. He swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the ache in his chest. The girl leaned closer to her brother. "Do you think he even remembers her?" she whispered. The boy shook his head. She said he pretends he doesn't even know her name. Thomas felt like a punch to the ribs. He didn't know their names. Didn't know their mother's name either, at least. Not yet, but something about their words stirred something deep in him. Regret, maybe, or guilt, or just the sinking awareness that no matter how good your intentions, you could still cause someone else pain without even realizing it. He didn't want to interrupt them. He didn't want to scare them. But he needed to know more. So he stayed seated, still, quiet, listening. "Why are we even here?" the girl asked. "He won't care. He has to care," the boy replied. "This is the only way." The only way to what? Thomas sat with that question heavy in his hands. His plan had been simple: walk in, browse like any customer, get a feel for the energy again, see how the staff interacted, see if the shelves still felt like home. But now the plan had changed. Now it wasn't about operations or staff morale. Now it was about two children and a story he might have helped bury. And the more he listened, the more he realized this wasn't just a twist in his day. Thomas didn't move right away. He sat still for another moment, feeling the edges of the story press in like the corners of an unopened letter. There was a heaviness in the air, not from the soft buzz of fluorescent lighting or the low hum of pages being turned nearby, but from the weight of a truth he didn't yet understand. He stood slowly, as if any sudden movement might shatter the invisible barrier between him and the two children. They were still huddled together, whispering, casting glances toward the shelves, the front counter, then back to each other like soldiers planning something they weren't sure was right, but felt necessary. Thomas grabbed a random book from the shelf, a children's anthology about kindness, and walked quietly past them, stopping just short of the plush chair beside theirs. "Nice choice," he said softly, nodding to the graphic novel in the boy's hands. "That one's got a great ending." The boy looked up, startled. The girl stiffened beside him. For a second, nobody said a word. Thomas offered a warm, harmless smile. The kind of smile that says, "I'm not here to sell you anything. I'm just passing through. Sorry," he added gently. "Didn't mean to interrupt. Just, I love seeing kids reading. Makes this place feel alive." The girl tilted her head slightly, her eyes squinting. "Do you work here?" Thomas chuckled. "Not anymore," he said honestly. "I used to, a long time ago." It wasn't a lie. He hadn't clocked a shift here in over a decade. Not since Nook had expanded from one small store to a dozen across the state. The boy studied him. "You look kind of familiar," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Maybe," Thomas replied. "I get that sometimes." The girl looked at her brother, then back at Thomas. "We're just waiting for someone," she said quickly, as if trying to explain away their presence. Thomas nodded slowly. "Anyone I might know?" The kids went quiet. Then the boy, after a long pause, said, "Maybe, depends." Thomas leaned forward just a bit, softening his tone. "I couldn't help but overhear, earlier, about your mom, about someone who hurt her. I'm sorry if I'm out of line, but I used to know a lot of people who worked here. Writers, artists, maybe I knew her, too." The boy hesitated. Then he said, "Her name's Isabel Monroe." The name rang like a faint bell in Thomas's memory, distant but not unfamiliar. He searched his thoughts, trying to place it. Isabel, petite, soft-spoken, always wore a deep green cardigan. No matter the weather, she used to sit in the back office, scribbling notes in a lined notebook, whispering story ideas to herself. She was one of the early contributors when Nook was just beginning to publish local writers. But then, what? He remembered liking her work. Remembered the quiet awe he'd felt reading her manuscript. A series of children's stories about a brave little rabbit and a bakery in the clouds. They were strange and magical and full of heart. But somewhere along the way, the manuscript had been passed along, edited, adapted, repackaged by the team, and Isabel faded from the memory. His throat tightened. "I remember her," he said quietly. "She was talented, really talented." The girl's eyes narrowed. "Then why did you steal her story?" The words hit like a slap. Thomas blinked. What? You published her idea?" The boy said. "Mom told us everything. She sent in her story. Then someone else's name ended up on the cover, and she was never credited. And after that, no one would hire her." Thomas felt the ground shift beneath him. "I didn't know," he said, more to himself than to them. "I didn't know that happened." She said she tried to speak up. The girl added, "But your company didn't respond. Not even once." Thomas stared at them, his voice caught somewhere between defense and disbelief. He remembered the book they were talking about. It had been one of their earliest bestsellers. The author on the cover had been someone else, an external editor who'd done the formatting. But Isabel's fingerprints, they had been all over that story. He'd never realized. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I truly am." The boy didn't look convinced. "We didn't come here to hear sorry." The girl nodded. "We came here to see if you even remembered her." Thomas looked at them. Two children who had no reason to trust him, yet had come to the very store that had taken something precious from their mother. Not to cause a scene, not to break anything, but just to see if the man who had hurt their family still had a heart. "I think I need to talk to your mom," Thomas said, steadying himself. "Would she talk to me?" The girl didn't answer right away, but her eyes softened just slightly. "Maybe," she said, "if you really mean it." Thomas nodded. "I do." The boy reached into his backpack and scribbled something on the back of a bookmark, an address, a street name on the poor side of Willow Creek. He handed it over without a word. Thomas took it with care, like it was a second chance. "Thank you," he said, rising from the chair. I'll be there. As he turned to leave, he heard the girl whisper to her brother, "Do you think he really didn't know?" "I don't know," the boy replied, "but I think he's about to find out." And just like that, the story had changed, from quiet guilt to the beginning of something brave. The address scribbled on the back of that flimsy bookmark led Thomas down streets he hadn't driven in years. The further he got from downtown Willow Creek, the more familiar the air felt, not in a comforting way, but in the way you remember something you once tried to forget. The chipped sidewalks, the leaning power lines, apartment windows with quilts for curtains. He parked 2 blocks away, unsure why, maybe to clear his head, maybe because walking felt like the right thing to do before a conversation that might alter everything he thought he knew about himself. The building was modest, 3 stories of peeling paint in rust-colored brick. A single nameplate on the mailbox read, Monroe. He hesitated for a second outside the door. What could he even say that wouldn't sound like an excuse? When the door finally opened, it was the boy, Ethan. No anger in his face this time, just caution. Behind him, Maya peeked around the corner. "She's home," Ethan said. "She doesn't know you're coming, but we told her someone might drop by." Thomas nodded. "That's fair." They stepped aside. Inside, the apartment was small but carefully kept. Faint hints of lavender hung in the air, the kind that lingers in old furniture and well-worn sweaters. Bookshelves lined the walls, most of them secondhand. On the far side, past a tiny dining table stacked with papers, sat a woman on a worn-out couch, her back turned to the door. "Mom," Maya said softly, "he's here." The woman turned slowly. Thomas's breath caught. It had been over a decade. But Isabel Monroe hadn't changed in the ways that mattered. The hair was streaked with gray now, and the fire in her eyes was quieter, but it was still there. He remembered that expression. It was the same one she used to wear when she disagreed with an edit but stayed polite anyway. "Thomas Ellison," she said calmly, "didn't expect to see you." He stepped forward slowly, removing his cap. "Neither did I, not like this." She motioned toward the chair across from her. "Sit, if you're not just here to clear your conscience and leave." Her tone wasn't cruel, just honest. Thomas sat. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt full of all the years they hadn't shared. Then he finally broke the silence. "I met your kids today," he said. "They came into the store looking for answers." Her gaze softened briefly. "They're good kids. Brave, too. I didn't ask them to do that." "I know," Thomas replied, "but I'm glad they did." He took a breath, choosing his next words with care. "Isabel, I didn't know about what happened, about your story." She raised an eyebrow. "Didn't know? I remember reading it," he said. "Your manuscript, The Rabbit in the Bakery in the Clouds. I thought it was beautiful. But then I blinked and it was on someone else's desk. Someone else's name on the cover. And I didn't ask questions. I didn't check where it came from or who really created it. I just let the system run." She folded her arms, voice low. "That story was mine, Thomas. I wrote every word of it on the back table during my breaks. I submitted it through the internal portal, and no one ever called me back. Until months later when the book was printed, and I saw pieces of my sentences dressed up in someone else's language." Thomas nodded. "I believe you." She tilted her head. "Now you do." "I should have then," he admitted. "I should have fought harder to build a system where no voice got buried. But I didn't. I was too focused on scaling, expanding, keeping the lights on. I didn't see what was getting lost in the margins." Isabel's eyes glistened, but she didn't cry. "You didn't just lose my words," she said. "You lost my trust. You made me feel invisible in the very place where I used to belong." Silence wrapped around them again. Not awkward, just heavy. "I'm not here to erase the past," Thomas said finally. "I know I can't, but I came because I want to listen, to really listen. And to ask, what would it look like to start making this right?" Isabel studied him, eyes searching for cracks in his tone. Then she sighed. "I don't want a payout," she said. "I don't want a charity gesture or some PR campaign. I want what I always wanted, a chance for my stories to live in the world. On my terms, with my name." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then that's where we begin." A pause. "I'd like to publish your original manuscript," he continued, "exactly as you wrote it. with your name on the cover, with full royalties, and not just that, Book Nook will create a new imprint. For writers like you, for voices that got lost, and I'd like you to help lead it. For the first time, Isabel blinked, like she hadn't expected that part. I'd like to bring you on as editor-in-residence. He added, not to fix the past, but to shape the future. Isabel leaned back slowly, her kids peeked in from the hallway, faces wide-eyed, and in a voice much softer than before. She said, let me think about it. Thomas smiled, take all the time you need. Then, rising from the couch, he turned to leave, but paused at the door. Thank you for being honest with me, he said. I hope I can earn that honesty again. Outside, the wind had picked up, scattering loose leaves across the sidewalk. But something inside Thomas had settled, because sometimes redemption doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from the first quiet moment when you choose not to walk away. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He sat at the old desk in his study, one he hadn't used in months, staring at a copy of the very book that had caused all this pain. The polished, best-selling version, glossy cover, smiling, official author on the back jacket. But now, the pages felt heavier than before. Because between those lines, he could now hear Isabel's voice. Not the version that had been rewritten, reformatted, and quietly reassigned, but the original voice, a mother's imagination, a woman who used to scribble ideas between shelving shifts and stock counts. A story written not for profit, but for her children. He placed the book down, turned it face down. Then he picked up his phone and began making calls. By morning, the wheels were already turning. It started with an internal memo. All editorial submissions will be reviewed under a new transparency protocol. Effective immediately, every contributor will receive full acknowledgement, tracked revisions, and author consultation before any final approvals are made. But Thomas knew a memo wasn't enough. Not this time. He scheduled an all-staff meeting for Friday afternoon. Everyone, managers, editors, frontline booksellers, even regional reps, were called in. A full gathering at the flagship Bookstore in Willow Creek. No one knew what it was about. Some suspected layoffs, others whispered expansion. The tension buzzed in the air like static. When the lights dimmed, Thomas stepped forward, not as the CEO with the rehearsed tone, but as a man still learning how to own his mistakes. I'm not here today to talk about profits, he began, eyes sweeping the room, or foot traffic, or how many locations we'll open next quarter. He paused, letting the silence breathe. I'm here to talk about a story, and the woman who wrote it. He clicked a remote. Behind him, on the screen, appeared a scanned image of an old manuscript. Yellowed pages, handwritten notes in the margins. At the bottom, written by Isabel Munro. A soft ripple moved through the crowd. You might recognize the story, he said, because many of you have sold thousands of copies of a version of it. But what you may not know, what I didn't know, or chose not to know, is that this story didn't come from a publishing house. It came from one of our own. He took a breath, the weight of years rested on his shoulders. Isabel Munro worked at this very store over a decade ago. She submitted this manuscript through our internal creative submission program. But something went wrong, terribly wrong, and somewhere along the way, she was erased. People shifted in their chairs. Some looked stunned, others ashamed. I was the CEO when this happened, Thomas said, and I didn't catch it. I didn't ask the right questions. I trusted a system that rewarded speed over fairness. And someone paid the price. He held up a copy of the republished edition, this one with a new title, a new cover, and a new author credit. One name in bold, Isabel Munro. This is the original manuscript, fully restored, and it will be the first release under our new imprint, Second Voice Press. An imprint dedicated to rediscovering and honoring the voices we've overlooked, ignored, or lost along the way. The room was silent now, not from confusion, but reverence. I've also asked Isabel to return. He continued, not as an employee, but as editor-in-residence. She'll help lead this initiative and guide new authors who might not have had a seat at the table before. Just then, the back doors opened, and there she was. Isabel stepped into the room, not with a speech, not with a PR grin, but with quiet dignity. She nodded once, briefly, to the crowd, and that was all it took. Applause began slowly. then swelled, not just for the story, but for what she represented. Thomas waited until the room calmed again before finishing. Book Nook, he said gently, was never just built on shelves or sales. It was built on stories. And stories, he said, his voice catching slightly, deserve to be told with honesty, with care, and with the names of the people who gave them life. He stepped aside, letting the new name, the new cover, and the woman who wrote it stand in the spotlight. Outside, the storefront had been updated. Where once the windows boasted bestseller charts and seasonal promotions, now stood a display of Monroe's Dream Day, with quotes from young readers, signed editions, and a handwritten letter from Isabel herself framed in the center. The community showed up in droves. Parents came with kids who had loved the original book. Teachers brought entire classrooms. Local press caught the story. And within days, national media followed. But through it all, Isabel stayed grounded. She did the one thing she had always done best. She listened. To aspiring authors, to kids with crumbled notebooks, to grown-ups who whispered, "I used to write, but life got in the way." She just smiled. It's never too late. And Thomas, he didn't stand next to her during interviews. He didn't try to steal back the mic. He stayed behind the camera, making sure this time she had the full stage. Because redemption doesn't mean taking center stage. It means building one for someone else. The following weeks changed everything. At first, the buzz felt like a wave crashing through the Book Nook system, unexpected, powerful, and strangely healing. Customers began coming in not just to buy books but to ask about them, about the story behind the story. They asked about Isabel, they asked about Second Voice Press, and most of all, they asked a question Thomas hadn't heard in years. Who wrote this? The name, Isabel Monroe, was no longer a whispered footnote in a forgotten filing cabinet. It was printed in silver foil on book covers. It was spoken with reverence in classrooms. It became a beacon for quiet creators, those who once thought their voices didn't matter. Inside the Willow Creek store, Isabel returned to a place that had once stolen something from her, not with resentment, but with grace. Her new desk sat in the center of the creative lounge, no longer tucked away in a stockroom, no longer hidden behind assistant editor labels. She read every manuscript that crossed her desk with care. She gave gentle feedback. She praised honest writing. She asked hard questions, but never, ever, did she forget what it felt like to be dismissed. And now she made sure no one else would be. Each week, Book Nook held open workshops. Write your first chapter. Story seeds for kids. Letters to the future you. It wasn't just about publishing anymore. It was about restoring belief. At the first, Monroe's Dream Day, the bookstore was packed beyond capacity. Children sat cross-legged in the reading corner, clutching their newly signed copies. Parents took photos. Retired teachers wept quietly in the back row. And Thomas, he stood near the entrance, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a fresh copy of Isabel's book, this time with a handwritten dedication on the first page. To the man who stopped long enough to listen. Thank you for letting stories breathe again. I am. The event was live-streamed on the store's social media, a decision made by one of the junior managers. Within 48 hours, the video had gone viral, not because of any controversy, but because people recognized something rare. A company owning up, a woman returning with grace, and a quiet community choosing to heal together. But the real shift, the one that mattered most, happened away from the spotlight. It happened in the break room, where an 18-year-old bookseller nervously handed Isabel her short story about a dragon who couldn't breathe fire. Only flowers. It happened in the donation bin out front, now overflowing with gently used children's books for underserved schools, an idea sparked by Isabel's son Ethan. And it happened when Thomas gathered the entire corporate team at headquarters for one of the most vulnerable speeches of his life. They met in a circle, no podium, no PowerPoint. I built Book Nook, he began, thinking it was about access, giving people books they loved, stories they needed. But somewhere along the way, we got too good at selling stories and forgot how to listen to the ones not yet told. He looked around the room at executives, editors, interns, some of whom had only joined the company in the past year. Isabel Monroe's story reminded me of something simple, He continued, "A story doesn't live until the right name is printed on the cover. And people don't thrive unless their voice is heard, not borrowed. Not brushed over, but heard." He paused, then added, "So we're changing how we do things." That day, they announced a new internal mandate. Every employee, regardless of title, would have 1 day a month dedicated solely to creative work, whether writing, drawing, journaling, or storytelling. It was paid, it was protected, and it was called Voice Day. They also launched the Forgotten Ink Fund, a partnership with community colleges and youth centers to support aspiring writers who lacked access to traditional publishing pathways. And most poignantly, they redesigned their employee badge system. On the back of each ID now reads a quote Isabel had once scribbled on a napkin while shelving cookbooks. "A name is not just a signature, it's a promise that you existed." That line stayed with Thomas long after the applause had faded, long after reporters moved on, long after Isabel quietly returned home to tuck Maya and Ethan into bed. And on some mornings, when Thomas opened the store early, alone, before the town had woken up, he would walk past the new shelf they'd built near the entrance. The voices we almost missed. It was a modest display. No spotlights, no glitter, just stories that had been overlooked. The authors once told that they weren't ready. Books that had been left on hard drives, in drawers, on shelves, now stand proudly with ISBNs and proper credits. Sometimes, customers stopped to read the placard posted beside the shelf. Most smiled, some cried, because the sign didn't say bestsellers. It said, "We believe in second chapters." And as Thomas stood near the counter, wiping dust from a stack of new releases, he thought back to that quiet day when 2 children whispered in the corner. Isabel stood in front of the whiteboard, a dry erase marker in one hand and a stack of children's drawings in the other. Behind her, the windows of Ellison's book Nook caught the soft morning light, casting a glow on the rows of worn beanbags and low shelves filled with dog-eared copies of Roald Dahl, Kate DiCamillo, and graphic novels with cracked spines. Across from her, a small group of wide-eyed third graders sat cross-legged, chewing on pencils and whispering with excitement. "Who here," she asked gently, "has ever wanted to write a story but didn't know where to start?" Tiny hands flew up. A boy in a red hoodie said, "I had a dream last night that I was a sandwich and no one wanted to eat me. And then I grew arms and escaped the lunchbox." The class burst out laughing, and Isabel laughed too. The kind of laugh that comes from deep down, from somewhere that had been dormant for years. "Then that," she said, smiling, "is where your story begins." The kids didn't know her past. They didn't need to. To them, she wasn't a forgotten author or woman who'd once been erased. She was simply Ms. Monroe, the story lady who came on Tuesdays and helped them believe their words mattered. Outside the classroom, in the quieter corners of the bookstore, other stories were beginning to write themselves. Ethan, now 13, stood beside the manga section. His voice had changed recently, lower, but his heart was still the same, observant, quiet, kind. He was volunteering now, shelving books, recommending titles, helping younger kids find comics that didn't overwhelm them with text. He didn't talk much about the early days, the whispers in the children's corner, the bitterness, but Thomas noticed that whenever a customer picked up his mother's book, Ethan's shoulders seemed to lift just slightly. He carried pride like a secret badge. Maya, now 11, had taken it a step further. She'd begun drawing again, little comics in the margins of her schoolwork, tiny stories about a robot who only spoke in poems, and a fox who ran a bakery on Mars. And every Wednesday after school, she sat at the staff table in the back of the store, where Isabel used to eat her lunch alone, and Maya taught her own micro-workshop, how to make a 3-page comic. The class had 4 students. One was a homeschooled girl with social anxiety. One was a foster kid who had changed schools 3 times in 1 year. One was a boy who stuttered when he read out loud, but drew panels like a pro. And the 4th was Maya herself. They met weekly. They didn't post anything online. They just drew, quietly, together, and in those moments, the bookstore felt like something bigger than retail. It felt like a home. One afternoon, Thomas watched all of it from the mezzanine, coffee in hand, not saying a word, just observing. just absorbing. He remembered what Isabel had said to him months ago. I don't need a title. I just need a place where I can give back what was taken. She'd meant more than a job. She meant her dignity, her purpose. And now, watching her teach again, truly teach, not just about verbs and plot structure, but about worth, Thomas realized something else. The real miracle wasn't that Book Nook had changed. It was that it had listened. Later that evening, after closing hours, Thomas walked the dim aisles, straightening covers and picking up gum wrappers. He paused by a small display near the checkout counter, a new section Ethan had designed. Voices We Almost Missed, Kids Edition. Each book was written or illustrated by a child from one of Isabel's or Maya's workshops. Self-published through the store's new community press program. Printed in small batches, hand-bound with staples and string. He picked up one. The cover was a crude drawing of a turtle in a cape. Title: The Turtle Who Didn't Run Away. Author: Dylan M., age 9. Inside the front flap was a simple dedication. To Ms. Monroe, who told me my ideas weren't dumb. Thomas felt the lump in his throat before he could fight it. Because that's what it had always been about. Not margins, not reviews, not even success. It was about permission, about telling someone, you matter, even if no one clapped when you walked in. That night, Thomas sent out one email to every store manager in the Book Nook system. Subject line: Every store needs a Monroe. Body: Starting next quarter, we'll launch our Resident Storyteller program in every Book Nook location. Each store will invite one local writer, teacher, or storyteller, especially those with non-traditional paths, to host monthly workshops for kids and teens. The only requirement: they must know what it's like to be ignored and choose to listen instead. Because second chances don't come from head offices. They come from hearts. Let's build more of those. Thomas. By morning, the replies had already begun. Subject lines like, I know the perfect person in Tucson. There's a woman here who writes poetry at bus stops. Yes, yes, yes. And for the first time in months, Thomas didn't feel like the CEO of a bookstore. He felt like a gardener. And in this quiet, story-filled soil, something beautiful had started to grow. It was the first Saturday of spring. The front bell of Ellison's Book Nook jingled with every breeze of warm air. The storefront windows slightly fogged from the bakery down the block, and the soft murmur of children's laughter drifted between bookshelves. The chalkboard out front had been freshly updated. In Maya's unmistakable handwriting, it read, Today's author, everyone. Inside, Thomas Ellison stood quietly near the biography section, his hands tucked into his coat pockets, watching the morning unfold. He'd gotten used to these Saturdays, the store no longer just a place of sales, but of returns, not the kind with receipts, but the kind where people return to themselves. A small knock at the door caught his attention. A teenage girl stood outside with a white cane folded under her arm. She wore a backpack nearly as big as her frame, and her dark hair was tucked behind large headphones. When Isabel opened the door, the girl hesitated. I heard there's writing today, she said, almost apologetically. I don't know if I can, but I want to try. Isabel smiled without a second of hesitation. Then you're already in the right place. She guided the girl to the community table in the back, where a circle of students and volunteers had begun passing around a bowl of sharpened pencils and a tray of bakery cookies. Next to them, a young man in a faded hoodie was wiping down the children's shelves with gentle precision. He was maybe 16, not a regular. Thomas recognized him from somewhere, but couldn't place it until the boy looked up and caught his eye. There was a flicker of something between them. Not guilt, recognition. The boy nodded slowly. He was the one who had been caught shoplifting a book 2 years ago. A battered fantasy novel about a girl who spoke to trees. He had cried in the stairwell after Thomas pulled him aside. Back then, Thomas had said only one thing. If you ever want to earn a book instead, come back. Now, here he was, sleeves rolled up, stacking books about dinosaurs, working, belonging, and next to the register, a man in his early 40s sat on a stool, reading aloud to his young daughter. His voice was soft, a little rusty. He stumbled occasionally, paused to sound out the longer words, but the girl beamed every time he pronounced something right. Thomas walked by, slowing just enough to hear a fragment of a sentence. And the little mouse, though afraid, stepped forward. The man caught Thomas's glance and offered a small, grateful smile. Thomas nodded back, understanding more than he could say. He remembered this man, too. A single father who'd once asked if Book Nook had any how to read aloud classes. He'd been too embarrassed to say why, until Isabel told him, "We all start somewhere." Now, he comes in every Saturday, not to buy books, but to read them, to practice, to stumble, to grow, to love his daughter, the only way he knew how, out loud. And that, Thomas thought, was the quiet truth of second chances. They rarely look like headlines. More often, they look like this: a hesitant knock on a bookstore door. A girl is unfolding her cane. A teenage boy returning without shame. A man is reading a children's book one syllable at a time. And a room full of people saying, without words, "You belong here, too." Later that afternoon, Thomas stepped behind the counter to restock the printer paper. Maya was there, legs swinging from a stool, drawing comics in her sketchbook. She looked up. "Do you think," she asked, "the stories we tell now can change the endings of the ones we didn't finish before?" Thomas paused, her question catching him off guard. He smiled gently. "I think," he said, "they're the only things that can." That night, after closing, he sat at his desk upstairs with a cup of chamomile tea and began drafting a letter to all store managers, one he'd been thinking about for weeks. Subject line: new front window sign, effective immediately. Body: team. Beginning next month, all Ellison's Book Nook stores will replace the standard welcome decal with the following phrase. In large print on front glass. Your story is still worth telling. No branding, no hashtags, just that, because what we offer isn't just books. It's the courage to begin again. Please install before the first Saturday of next month. T. Ellison. He hit send and sat back in his chair. From downstairs, he heard laughter. Isabel chatting with the high school volunteers as they closed out the register. Ethan and Maya are arguing over which book to recommend next week. It was soft, but it was there, the sound of something real. The sound of healing, of not just a bookstore being rebuilt, but of a world, one reader at a time. 5 years later, Ellison's Book Nook was still standing. Not as a chain, but as a compass, across the state. In small towns and sleepy suburbs, parents still held their children's hands as they stepped under the familiar green awning. The bell above the door still chiming softly like a wind chime in a quiet yard. But now, every location had something different, something added. Near the front window, just to the left of the register, in a frame no one could miss, sat a portrait. A faded photo of a woman with auburn hair tied in a loose bun, smiling behind a tower of books and manuscript pages. Beneath it, engraved in quiet dignity, Isabel Monroe, storyteller, survivor, teacher. Thomas Ellison hadn't made it a requirement. He hadn't needed to. Every store manager across the network had asked for it. Some had added a shelf nearby labeled, "The Voices We Almost Lost." Others built reading corners named Monroe's Corner, where kids could write stories, and older folks could record memoirs. It had become more than homage. It had become a movement. And at the center of it, Isabel had found her rhythm. She now led the Ellison Fellowship, a mentorship and publishing initiative that gave full support to female and marginalized authors with unfinished dreams. Not out of charity, but the literary world was poorer without them. Each year, the program released one special print run, hand-bound copies of debut works from voices that might never have made it to a shelf otherwise. They called it the Dreamers Collection. And each year, on Monroe's Dream Day, March 17th, the anniversary of Isabel's book release, those stories were read aloud in every branch. Children dressed as their favorite characters. Teenagers organized open mics. Elders wept softly in corners, their weathered hands resting on pages they never thought they'd see in print. Back in Willow Creek, the original store had barely changed. The same creaky floors, the same mismatched lampshades, but it breathed differently now. There was a warmth in the corners, a reverence in the silence. On this particular afternoon, Isabel stood behind the counter, not as an employee, not as a guest, but as the heartbeat of the place. She was adjusting the new arrivals table when a girl of about 12 approached her. The child held a stapled bundle of pages, crinkled from being read too many times. "I finished my first story," she said shyly. Isabel crouched down, eyes meeting hers. "What's it about?" The girl beamed. "A squirrel who forgets how to write but finds his way back with the help of a blind owl and a kid who used to steal acorns." Isabel laughed, a full, deep laugh that filled the store. "I think that's exactly the kind of story the world needs." She accepted the bundle with both hands. "Let's find a shelf for this." In the far corner, Thomas watched quietly, as he always did. He had grown older. The gray in his beard is more pronounced now, but his eyes still softened every time a child pushed open the door. Next to him stood Ethan, now 17, tall, thoughtful, and already mentoring the next generation of volunteers. Maya, 15, had started a podcast from the back room called Whispers from the Book Nook, where she interviewed local storytellers and read passages from overlooked authors. They had grown, not just in age, but in voice. They no longer whispered, they stood tall. One evening, as the store prepared to close, Isabel approached Thomas. She held a new plaque, wooden, simple, but beautiful. "I think it's time we change the motto again," she said, smiling. Thomas read the inscription. "We don't just carry stories. We carry those who were almost never told." He didn't say anything right away. Instead, he looked around at the children sorting bookmarks, the retirees flipping through poetry, the young volunteers erasing the whiteboard schedule with quiet pride. Then he nodded. "Put it up." That night, as the store went dark and the wind rolled through Willow Creek, a single light remained glowing above the plaque. It wasn't bright, but it was steady, like a lighthouse, for all the stories still waiting to find their voice. You can't rewrite the past, but you can choose what gets printed next. Thomas Ellison built an empire from paper and ink, but it wasn't until he listened, truly listened, that he understood. A bookstore is not just about selling stories. It's about giving forgotten voices a shelf to stand on. Isabel didn't need saving. She needed to be reminded. And when she was remembered, she lit a path for hundreds more. Because sometimes the most powerful stories, they're the ones who almost weren't told. So before you close the book on someone's chapter, ask yourself, have I really heard their story yet?